psychoanalytic theory by Sigmund Freud. And when we talk about psychoanalytic theory, as I said, Sigmund Freud was the first one, and Freud was the first psychologist who developed a systematic theory of personality. And he not only described what personality is, but also why personality assumes particular place and how it develops. And according to him, according to Sigmund Freud, the sphere of mind is divided into three regions, as he calls it, to be the conscious, preconscious and the unconscious. These are the three regions which has been given by him. And when we talk about conscious level, conscious level contains everything which we are aware of at a given moment, and only a small amount of mental life, like the perception, thoughts, memories, feelings are contained in the realm of consciousness. And whatever the conscious experience may be for a given period, it is the result of selective screening, which is regulated by external cues. So which means there are external cues which does influence what we are going to select, and whatever was once conscious, it moves on to the preconscious stage after a brief time, and then moves on to unconscious if we don't use these things for a longer time. So this is something about the conscious region. So from conscious region, let's move on to the preconscious domain, which Sigmund Freud calls it to be the available memory. So why does he use the term available memories? Because whenever there is a need for us to know what are the things which we have stored it in the preconscious level, these things can be brought back to the conscious level. So because of that only we call it to be the available memory. And this preconscious region acts as a bridge between the conscious and the unconscious level. So from preconscious level, we move on to the next one, which is unconscious level. This is considered to be the deepest and major strata of human mind. And according to Sigmund Freud, unconscious is not a hypothetical abstraction, but according to him, it is a reality which can be proved and demonstrated. But Freud also believed that the really significant aspects of human behavior are shaped and are directed by the impulses and driven totally outside the realm of awareness, which means we are not controlled by the conscious level. More than the conscious level, it's the unconscious which influences many of our behavior. So these were the three regions which he gave at the earlier years. But this concept of unconscious mental process, as I said, was the earlier description, was then alternate, and he alternate to include three structures which he calls it to be id, ego and superego. So from there it was three regions. Later on he modified into a structural model where he calls it to be three structures. And when we talk about it is mainly pleasure-seeking principle. When we talk about ego, it's the reality principle. When we talk about superego, it's the morality principle. And let's see what is it. As I said, it refers to the pleasure-seeking principle. It refers to innate component of personality. We call it to be the mental agency, which contains everything which is inherited, which is present at birth, and which is fixed in the individual's constitution. So for this only we call it to be a instinct, especially instincts, and it is raw, animalistic, obeys no rules and regulations, knows no rules, knows no laws, remains basic to the individual throughout life. And the basic principle that governs the function of the id is termed as pleasure principle. And according to this pleasure principle, every person desires to keep his level of psychic tension at a minimum. To achieve pleasure, energy must not get too high, which is pleasure is ensured only when the levels of psychic energy remains low and tension is decreased. And as I said, it mainly works on the basis of pleasure-seeking principle. To avoid pain and to obtain pleasure, what are the processes which it has into its command. And the two basic process which this it has is, we call it to be the reflex action and the primary process. So these are the two processes which are available for the id to avoid pain and to obtain pleasure. So now what is this reflex action? Now when we talk about reflex action, they are inborn, they are automatic reactions like knee-jerking, sneezing. So all these things comes under reflex action, which releases tension immediately. So whenever we are at a tension, it immediately reduces tension for us. So this is reflex action. But when we talk about primary process, it involves a much more complicated process. And what is this primary process actually? It attempts to discharge the tension by forming an image of an object that will resolve the tension. Now how will we form an image of a particular object? Now take for example, we are hungry exactly at 12:30. Now what we do is we try to form an image of a food, thereby our wish is somehow fulfilled. We try to reduce our tension by making an image of this picture in our mind. So the term given for this is wish fulfillment. So this is the primary process. This is the second process which this id has. So the first one being reflex action, the second one being primary process. Now when you go for ego we call it to be the reality principle, which means it is said to obey the reality principle and to operate by means of secondary process. So when we were talking about it, it was the primary process, and when we go for ego, it's the secondary process, which means the aim of the reality principle is to prevent the discharge of tension until an object that is appropriate for the satisfaction of need has been observed. So when we take the same example, like I'm hungry exactly at 12:30, what will we do? We wait till the bell rings, and then only we try to do our own thing, which means the reality principle says that we should not go out at this moment until the bell rings, and it's only when the bell rings there is a permission for us to move out, we can go. So the So I said the ego works on the basis of secondary process, and when we talk about secondary process, the secondary process is realistic thinking. What is this realistic thinking? Now there I said it to be wish fulfillment, and here I am just saying it to be realistic thinking. By means of secondary process, the ego formulates a plan for the satisfaction of a need and then tests this plan, usually by some kind of action, to see whether or not it works. Now take for example, I'm hungry, I try to make a plan, like if I go to so and so place, will I be able to get the food which I need? So this is nothing but realistic thinking. And the other process which this ego works is realistic testing. So realistic thinking is entirely different from realistic testing. In realistic thinking, we try to make a plan, and when we talk about realistic testing, we try to test the plan which we have made it. So this is realistic testing. So, this is something about ego. And when we go for super ego, as I said it to be the morality principle, this super ego also has two processes at its command. One we call it to be conscience. The other one we call it to be ego ideal. Now what is conscience and what is ego ideal? So super ego is the moral area of personality, and as I said, we have two processes when we talk about super ego, ego ideal and conscience, which means whatever the children say is wrong, whatever the parents say that these things are wrong, that enters into conscience, and whatever they are rewarded for whatever they are the parents say to be right, these things enter into ego ideal. Now these are the two processes which we have when we talk about super ego, and usually what we see is the children take in the standards and values of parents, and the term given for this is introjection. So the child takes in or introjects the moral standards of the parents. The conscience punishes the person from making him or her feel guilt, and the ego ideal rewards the persons from by making them feel proud. So these are the three structures. So from three regions, Sigmund Freud modified the personality to be consisting of three structures. And from here, let's move on to the stages of development. And when we were talking about psychoanalytic theory, this psychoanalytic theory of development is based on two premises. The first is the genetic approach, which emphasizes that adult personality is shaped by the various types of early childhood experiences, which means whatever happens in the earlier years, whatever experiences we have at the earlier years, this influences our later adult personality according to Sigmund Freud. And the second is that a certain amount of sexual energy is present at birth and that thereafter progresses through a series of psychosexual stages. And when I said there are stages of development, we have 5 stages of development that have been given by Sigmund Freud. The first stage, which he calls it to be the oral stage, the second one he calls it to be the anal stage, third one he calls it to be the phallic stage, and the fourth one he calls it to be the latency, and the last one is the genital stage. And these 4 stages which have been given by Freud is a universal stages, and every child passes through these stages in a order. That is, it's after oral a child moves on to anal, after anal a child moves on to the phallic, and then to the latency, and then to the genital. And who completes fast is left to the child itself. So when we talk about oral stage, what is this oral stage? Actually, we do find each stage has its own erogenous zone. The child gets pleasure out of sucking, like it can be anything, sucking the thumb, sucking a bottle, and all those things. So during this oral stage, mouth, lips are considered to be the more important erogenous zone. So from here, Sigmund Freud moves on to the next stage, which is anal stage, and here from the mouth and lips, the erogenous zone shifts to the anus here. And when we talk about anal stage, the child gets pleasure out of controlling, that is, out of letting go of or withholding his bowel movements. So again, the parents should not be too harsh during these periods. In case if the parents are too harsh, we do find the child gets fixated at each stage. This fixation might lead to other adult personality characteristics. Now from mouth and lips to the anus, there is a shift in the erogenous zone. To the genitals, that is in the phallic stage, we do find the child concentrating much upon his own body. The child is self-centered, and we do find the child manipulating his own genitals. And during this phallic stage itself, we have 2 important complexes, which we call it to be Oedipus complex and Electra complex. Oedipus complex is for boys, and the Electra complex is for girls. So when we talk about Oedipus complex, we do find the boys want to replace their father. They want to possess their mother. They have a romantic love towards their mother. This type of behavior is seen at the earlier years, always want to replacing their father and want to be with their mother always. And slowly the child comes to overcome this type of behavior, which means the child or the boy comes to understand that the father is much more powerful than me, and the father might cut off my penis, and castration anxiety. The boy has a fear that a father who is much more powerful than me will cut off my penis if I have such type of romantic feelings towards my mother. So this slowly what happens is this type of behavior is suppressed, and the child comes to identify himself with the aggressor. So identification of aggressor is seen during this time. So this is for the boys. And if we go for Electra complex, this is for girls. And here we do find the girls having a love towards their father and hatred towards the mother, and they feel that they have a defective condition, which means they blame the mother for the girls not having penis, and they have this penis envy. And this type of behavior slowly disappears as they move on towards 5 years of age. So for each stage, the child have to overcome these conflicts. And when we go on to the latency stage, there is no such type of erogenous zone. So from mouth and lip to the anus to the genitals, here during the latency stage, which is seen at the age of 6 years, we do find much of the energy is channeled into some other area. Instead of having the sexual desires, we do find the child concentrating more on the studies and try to excel in his studies, trying to prove him or her own self in their own field. So these types of behaviors are seen during the latency period. From here, if we move on to the genital stage, which is seen during the adolescence period, once again we find the sexual feelings which was once repressed bursts forth, and a mutual liking is seen, or mutual liking is always seen between the opposite genders. So this type of behavior is seen. So by the end of this genital stage, the psychosexual stages are over, and each stage has, as I said, has its own erogenous zone. And in case if the child gets fixated, there are many types of adult personality characteristics which does influence an individual's personality after their growth. So this is something about your stages of development. As we were talking about the 5 stages of development or psychosexual development, we also, though I said it did move till adolescence, but what Freud felt was, according to him, personality was pretty well formed by the end of 5th year, which means whatever should have been formed, everything is completely over by the age of 5, which means before phallic stage itself. So personality develops in response to 4 major sources of tension. One is physiological growth processes. We do have tension during these growth processes. The second one is frustration. The third one is conflicts. The last one is threats. So whenever there is an increase in tension, ensuring from these sources, the person is forced to learn new methods of reducing tension. This learning is what is meant by personality development. And we have 2 more things known as identification and displacement. Identification and displacement are 2 methods by which the individual learns to resolve frustration, conflicts, and anxiety. And when we talk about identification, as I said, we usually identify ourselves to that of our parents or to whosoever is successful. We tend to identify with them only. So this is something about your stages of development and your development of personality. If you go for ego defense mechanism, we do find that we tend to use many of the ego defense mechanism. But why do we use many of the ego defense mechanism? The one thing is when we talk about features of ego defense mechanism, we do find these ego defense mechanism, they tend to operate at the unconscious level, and therefore it is self-deceptive. The other one is they distort one's perception of reality so as to make anxiety less threatening to the individual. And there are many types of ego defense mechanism which we tend to use in our day-to-day lives, like we have sublimation, repression, displacement, and so on. So whenever we find the ego is threat, we tend to use all these types of ego defense mechanism. And when we talk about repression, which we call this to be the primary ego defense mechanism, which involves most direct approval in avoiding anxiety. Like we also call repression to be selective forgetting. Now, take for example, if I haven't got good marks in my examination, I say I have forgotten my marks. It's nothing but it's one type of ego defense mechanism. So using of this ego defense mechanism is important for a healthy personality. But again, you should not use this defense mechanism too much. So if we use these types of ego defense mechanism for all the things, that indicates that we are not, we haven't developed healthy personality. So for any individuals, a small amount of using this defense mechanism is important for a healthy development, healthy personality development. So this is something about your Sigmund Freud. So when we were talking about Sigmund Freud's theory, we went on from 3 regions to 3 structures. From there we went on to the 5 psychosexual stages, and from there the last one which we were talking was about the defense mechanism.